The cowboy didn't look at her torn shoes or the blood on her heel. He looked at her face and said something that made the entire town fall silent. A stagecoach door slammed against the wind as a young woman stepped onto the dusty street. One shoe split open, blood staining the cloth wrapped around her heel. A wealthy merchant turned away without touching her suitcase. Nearby, a cowboy stopped in the middle of leading his horse, staring at her for one long second, while the town held its breath. Then he walked forward and spoke 4 unexpected words. What would you have done in her place? Let me know in the comments, and come along for the story. Autumn arrived early in Cedar Ridge, Montana territory. The wind came down from the distant mountains and swept across the main street, carrying dust, dry grass, and the smell of horses. Wagons rattled over uneven boards. Men stood outside the general store with coffee cups warming their hands. Women crossed the street with baskets tucked against their skirts. Just after noon, the stagecoach rolled into town. Its wheels groaned as it stopped beside the depot. People looked up. Everyone knew why it had come. Preston Hale's mail-order bride had arrived. The coach door opened. A young woman stepped down carefully. Her brown dress was wrinkled from travel. Dust clung to the hem. A faded cloth bag hung from one shoulder. Then people noticed her shoes. The leather was cracked. The front of one shoe had split open. A strip of cloth had been wrapped around her heel to keep it together. Even that cloth was stained dark from a long journey. Savannah Reed stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the bright Montana sunlight. She had imagined this day for months. Not like this. Never like this. Across the street, Preston Hale straightened his expensive coat and walked forward. He was exactly as his letters had described. Well-dressed, confident, successful. For one brief second, Savannah allowed herself to hope. Then Preston's eyes dropped to her shoes. The hope vanished. His expression hardened. The crowd grew quiet. Preston looked her over from head to toe. Nobody spoke. Finally, he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, I paid for a bride, not a charity case. The words landed harder than the wind. Someone shifted awkwardly. Someone else looked away. Savannah felt her fingers tighten around the strap of her bag. Weeks on the road. The money she had saved. The promises she had believed. All of it seemed to collapse into that single sentence. Preston shook his head. This arrangement is finished. Then he turned and walked away. Just like that. No explanation. No apology. Only the sound of his polished boots fading down the boardwalk. Nobody followed him. Nobody followed her either. Savannah remained where she was, alone in the middle of Cedar Ridge. The wind tugged at her dress. Her heel throbbed. For a moment, she wondered if she should simply climb back onto the coach and disappear. A horse snorted nearby. She looked up. A cowboy stood beside a dark bay gelding. Broad shoulders, weathered hat, a face marked more by long days than by age. Clay Bennett. He had been leading his horse past the depot when he saw the blood on Savannah's heel. Saw the worn bag. Saw the way she refused to lower her head even after being humiliated in front of the whole town. Their eyes met. Clay studied her for a long moment. Not her dress, not her shoes. Her. Then he stepped forward. The crowd watched. What happens now? One man muttered. Clay ignored him. Savannah expected questions. Where are you from? Do you have money? What are you planning to do? Instead, Clay reached for her bag. His voice was calm, steady, as if the answer had already been decided. You're already home. Savannah stared at him. The words made no sense. Home? She had never seen this man before, yet something in his voice carried no doubt. No pity, no performance for the crowd. Only certainty. Clay secured her bag to the saddle, then offered his hand to help her onto the wagon seat beside him. For several seconds, she did not move. Then, slowly, she accepted. Behind them, whispers followed. Ahead of them, the road stretched toward the open country, toward Coyote Ridge Ranch, toward a future neither of them could yet see. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch. The house was small. The barn needed paint. The fences leaned in places, yet the windows glowed warm against the evening sky. Clay showed her the room beside the kitchen. "A wash basin's inside," he said. "Supper's at 6. Nothing more. No questions. No demands." After he left, Savannah sat alone on the edge of the bed. The room was simple, but clean, safe. She removed her damaged shoes and winced. Her feet were swollen from travel. For the first time all day, tears threatened. She blinked them away. Much later, after supper, she opened her door. A pair of repaired shoes sat neatly outside. The stitching was fresh, careful, strong. A ranch hand carrying firewood passed by and smiled. Clay spent half the night fixing those. Savannah looked down at the shoes, then toward the dark barn where a lantern still burned. The man who had repaired them never mentioned it, and somehow that meant more than if he had. She picked up the shoes and held them quietly against her chest, while the Montana wind moved softly through the night. The next morning began before sunrise. Savannah woke to the sound of a bucket being lowered into the well outside. Somewhere beyond the house, horses shifted in their stalls. A rooster crowed once, then again. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she saw the repaired shoes beside the bed. The memory returned. Cedar Ridge, the depot, Preston Hale, Clay Bennett. She dressed slowly and stepped into the kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the room. A cast-iron skillet hissed on the stove. Clay stood near the counter pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He glanced up when she entered. "Morning." "Morning." He slid 1 cup toward her. No questions. No mention of yesterday. Savannah wrapped both hands around the warm metal and sat by the window. Outside, dawn spread across the hills in pale gold bands. The ranch looked different in daylight, larger, more alive. Men were already moving between the barn and the corrals. A wagon stood near the fence waiting for repairs. A dog slept beside a stack of lumber. Clay unfolded a small ledger and placed it on the table. "Feed inventory." Savannah looked at him. "You keep records?" "Someone has to." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "I heard you're good with numbers." She stared at the ledger. The pages were neat, but crowded. Feed orders, hay deliveries, cattle counts, the kind of work she knew well. "Would you like me to help?" "If you want." "Not if you should. Not if you owe me. Only if you want." The words stayed with her long after breakfast. Days settled into a rhythm. Each morning she updated feed records and supply lists. Afternoons were spent mending shirts, repairing work gloves, and patching denim worn thin by saddle leather. No one treated her like a guest. No one treated her like a burden. The ranch hands thanked her when she fixed a coat, nodded when she handed them repaired shirts, then went back to work. Life moved forward. Simple. Steady. One cold morning she opened her door and found a stack of firewood neatly arranged on the porch. No note, no explanation. Just enough wood to last several days. She knew who had done it. When she saw Clay later repairing a gate hinge, she almost mentioned it. Almost. Instead, she simply watched him work. The hammer rose and fell. The gate straightened. He never looked toward the house to see if she had noticed. That somehow mattered. Weeks passed. The trees along the creek turned yellow. The air sharpened. One afternoon, Clay brought a young mare from the pasture. "She needs exercise." Savannah laughed nervously. "I haven't ridden in years. You remember more than you think." The mare stood quietly. Savannah placed one boot into the stirrup. Everything went well until the horse shifted unexpectedly. Her balance disappeared. She hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Clay reached her in seconds, then stopped. Half a step away, waiting, not hovering, not grabbing, waiting. Savannah blinked up at him. Embarrassment burned hotter than the fall. She pushed herself upright. Only then did Clay extend his hand. She took it. His grip was firm. Nothing more. Nothing less. "You all right?" "Yes." "You sure?" She brushed dirt from her skirt. "I'm sure." He nodded and released her hand immediately. The moment passed. But that evening she found herself thinking about it. He had come running, yet he had still allowed her dignity. Few people ever had. Later that week she traveled into Cedar Ridge with a wagon carrying supplies. The town was busy. Children chased each other past the blacksmith shop. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. A piano played faintly from the saloon across the street. Savannah stopped outside the general store. As she reached for the door, two women standing nearby lowered their voices. Not enough. Just enough. Clay only took her in because nobody else would. The other woman sighed. "Well, he's always been soft-hearted." Savannah froze. The words slipped beneath her skin before she could stop them. She stepped inside the store, bought flour, coffee, lamp oil. When she left, she kept her eyes down. The wagon ride back felt longer. The mountains seemed farther away, the wind colder. That evening, Clay noticed she spoke less. At supper, she answered questions with single words. She kept her eyes on her plate. Clay said nothing, but he noticed. He always seemed to notice. A few days later, Savannah returned to town alone to pick up thread ordered from Helena. As she approached the mercantile, two different women stood near the entrance. Neither saw her. A man like Clay would never choose a woman like her. The words landed cleanly, like a hammer striking a nail. The women continued talking. Neither realized Savannah had heard. She stood there for several seconds, then quietly turned around, the package of thread forgotten. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the street. She walked back toward the ranch alone. The repaired shoes carried her across the dusty road, but for the first time since arriving at Coyote Ridge, each step felt heavier than the last. Somewhere behind her, the town continued its ordinary business. Ahead of her, the ranch waited beneath the fading Montana sky. And for the first time, doubt walked beside her all the way home. The days that followed felt different. Nothing visible had changed. The cattle still moved through the lower pasture every morning. The cook stove still crackled before dawn. Clay still left for the corrals before most people were awake. Yet something small had shifted. Savannah spoke less. She stayed longer in her room after supper. She found reasons to keep busy when Clay entered a room. At first he thought she was tired. Then he thought perhaps she missed Missouri. After a while, he stopped guessing. He simply noticed. One cold November morning, Savannah opened the pantry door and found fresh jars of peaches lined neatly on the shelf. Winter stores, enough for months. She knew Clay had traded for them in town. The next afternoon, she discovered the loose board on the porch had been repaired. The day after that, she found a new oil lamp beside her sewing table. None of it came with a note. None of it came with expectations. Somehow that only made the whispers from town louder inside her head. A man like Clay would never choose a woman like her. The sentence followed her everywhere. Into the barn, into the garden, into her sleep. One evening, snow clouds gathered over the mountains. The ranch hands finished supper and drifted toward their bunkhouse. Savannah remained near the stove, mending a torn coat sleeve. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock above the mantel. The front door opened. Cold air followed Clay inside. He carried something folded over one arm. He removed his hat. Snowflakes melted slowly in his dark hair. "I stopped by Miller's store," he said. Savannah looked up. Clay crossed the room and placed the bundle carefully on the table. It was a winter coat. Dark brown wool. Strong stitching. Warm lining. The kind of coat built to survive Montana winters. Savannah stared at it. For a long moment she couldn't speak. Her fingers brushed the sleeve. It fit perfectly. Too perfectly. Clay shifted slightly. "The mornings are getting colder." The room fell silent. Savannah looked at the coat, then at Clay, then back at the coat again. Something painful tightened inside her chest. All the small kindnesses, the repaired shoes, the firewood, the peaches, the lamp. Now this. The whispers returned. "He only feels sorry for you." The needle slipped from her fingers. It struck the floor with a tiny sound. Clay immediately noticed. "You all right?" That question broke something loose. Savannah stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the floorboards. Clay frowned. Confused. Concerned. Nothing more. But she could no longer see it clearly. "I don't need your pity." The words came out sharper than she intended. The room became very still. Even the stove seemed quieter. Clay did not move. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Finally, he looked down at the coat, then back at her. His voice was low, steady. "That isn't what this is." Savannah felt tears threaten. She hated that. Hated feeling weak. Hated feeling exposed. Most of all, she hated wanting to believe him. But the fear was stronger. She looked away. Clay waited. Maybe expecting her to explain. Maybe hoping she would. She didn't. After another long silence, he picked up his hat. "I see." 3 simple words. Nothing angry. Nothing cruel. That somehow hurt more. He walked toward the door, paused briefly, then left. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty room. Savannah sank back into her chair. The coat remained on the table between them like something unfinished. The next week passed in uncomfortable quiet. Clay remained polite, respectful, distant. Exactly what Savannah thought she wanted. Exactly what made her miserable. Then one afternoon, she traveled into Cedar Ridge to deliver repaired shirts. Snow threatened overhead. The streets were muddy from recent rain. She stopped outside the laundry house near the creek. A help-wanted sign hung in the window. The owner needed another worker before winter. Savannah stood there longer than she intended. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe leaving would solve everything. Maybe Clay's life would be easier without her. The thought followed her all the way across town. That was when Ezekiel Price appeared. He stepped out from the land office wearing an expensive coat and polished boots. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew who he was, the wealthiest landowner in the county, the man who seemed interested in buying every acre around him, including Coyote Ridge Ranch. "Miss Reed." Savannah stopped. Price smiled pleasantly. Too pleasantly. "I hear you're working for Bennett. Living there." "Ah." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Then perhaps nobody has told you." "Told me what?" Price sighed as though discussing unfortunate news. "Bennett's situation." Savannah felt her stomach tighten. "What situation?" Price lowered his voice. "Debt." The word hung between them. He owes more than most people realize. Savannah stared at him. Price shook his head. "He works hard, I'll give him that. But hard work doesn't pay every bill." The first snowflakes drifted down around them. Savannah looked toward the distant hills, toward the ranch, toward the man she suddenly realized she might lose. Price studied her face, then delivered the final blow. Truth is, Miss Reed, keeping extra people around costs money. Savannah felt her breath catch. He probably means well. Price shrugged. But men do desperate things when they're cornered. That night, Savannah lay awake listening to the wind. The repaired shoes sat beside her bed. The winter coat hung on a hook near the door. Neither brought comfort anymore. Only questions. And before dawn arrived, a terrible idea had already begun to take shape. If leaving could save Clay, maybe she should go. Maybe she should be the one to make that choice before winter made it for everyone. Outside, the first snow of the season settled quietly over Coyote Ridge Ranch, and somewhere in Cedar Ridge, Ezekiel Price smiled to himself, knowing exactly which fear he had chosen to feed. For nearly a week, Savannah carried that fear alone. She continued mending shirts. She updated feed records. She swept the kitchen floor each evening before bed. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Inside, everything had changed. Every time Clay walked into a room, she wondered how much debt he carried. Every time she saw him repairing fences before sunrise or hauling feed sacks after dark, she wondered how much of that burden was hidden. And every time he showed her a kindness, guilt followed close behind. One afternoon, she rode into town and found Ezekiel Price waiting outside the land office. He greeted her with the patience of a man who already knew the answer he wanted. Price handed her several folded papers, official documents, tax notices, property records. Numbers covered the pages. Savannah recognized enough bookkeeping to understand what she was seeing, or what she thought she was seeing. Price pointed to several figures. Clay's behind. Savannah swallowed. He never said anything. Of course he didn't. Price adjusted his gloves. Pride keeps men quiet. The wind rattled a loose sign above the boardwalk. Price lowered his voice. There may be one way to help him. Savannah looked up. What way? A faint smile appeared. I need someone dependable at one of my properties north of town. A long-term contract. Simple work. He paused. In exchange, I could forgive what Bennett owes. The words struck her harder than the cold. That night, she sat alone beside the small lamp in her room. The repaired shoes rested beneath the bed. The winter coat hung beside the door. Everything around her reminded her of Clay. The kindness, the patience, the home he had offered without asking for anything in return. Maybe your life gets easier if I'm gone. The thought returned again and again. By dawn, she had made her decision. The first real winter storm arrived 3 days later. Gray clouds swallowed the mountains. Snow swept across the plains in long white curtains. The ranch hands hurried livestock into shelter. The wind screamed through gaps in the barn walls. Shortly after sunset, Savannah packed her few belongings. She left the winter coat folded neatly on the chair. Beside it, she placed a letter. Only one page. Only one sentence she could barely force herself to write. Maybe your life gets easier if I'm gone. Then she slipped out into the storm. The snow reached her ankles before she crossed the yard. The road toward Cedar Ridge had nearly vanished beneath drifting white. The repaired shoes carried her as far as they could. Then one soul began to separate. She kept walking. By the time she reached town, her feet were soaked and numb. The lights of the land office glowed through the storm. Inside, a coal stove burned near the wall. Price waited beside a desk, the contract already prepared, the pen already sitting beside it. Savannah stared at the document. One signature, one decision, one sacrifice. Price slid the paper closer. You'll be helping him. Savannah lowered herself into the chair. Her fingers closed around the pen. Back at Coyote Ridge Ranch, Clay returned from the barn after dark. Snow covered his shoulders. The house felt wrong immediately. Too quiet. Too empty. He saw the folded coat first, then the letter. For several seconds, he simply stared. The room seemed to tilt. He read the sentence once, then again. His jaw tightened. Outside, the storm worsened. At that same moment, someone knocked on the ranch door. Emily Carter stepped inside, snow covering her scarf. She had been searching for Savannah after hearing rumors in town. Within minutes, the truth spilled out. Price, the false debt, the contract, everything. Clay did not waste a single second. He grabbed his hat, his coat, the ranch ledger from the office shelf, a stack of tax receipts tied together with twine. Emily followed him to the porch. "You're riding out in this?" "I'm bringing her home." The horse burst through the storm like a dark shadow. Snow lashed against Clay's face. The road disappeared more than once. Still he rode. The wind stole his breath. Ice gathered along the brim of his hat. But he never slowed. Inside the land office, Savannah lowered the pen toward the paper. The door suddenly flew open. Cold air exploded into the room. Snow swirled across the floorboards. Both Savannah and Price turned. Clay Bennett stood in the doorway, breathing hard, covered in snow. His eyes found Savannah immediately. Nothing else. Only her. Price rose from his chair. "What is this?" Clay walked straight to the desk, without raising his voice, without threatening anyone. He placed several documents onto the wood. Tax receipts, property records, bank statements, official county filings, one after another. The papers spread across the desk. The ranch is paid. Price's face changed. Clay pointed to the receipts. Every tax. Another paper. Every loan. Another. Every acre. The room fell silent. A second knock sounded. Deputy Owen Brooks entered carrying a leather folder. Snow melted from his coat. "I'd like a word with Mr. Price." The deputy laid additional papers beside Clay's. Forged records, false notices, altered debt claims. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Price's confidence vanished. Savannah looked from one document to another. Her hands trembled. Everything she believed, everything she sacrificed for, everything had been built on a lie. Price lowered his eyes. The deputy stepped forward. The storm continued outside. But inside the room, another storm had already ended. Savannah stared at the desk, at the receipts, at Clay, at the truth she had almost traded her future to protect. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, she realized the greatest thing standing between her and happiness had never been poverty. It had been the fear that she was never worth staying for. Then Clay reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft by time. The edges were frayed. The creases had nearly disappeared from being opened and closed too many times. Savannah stared at it. She knew that paper. Before Clay even unfolded it, she knew. Her breath caught. No. Clay carefully opened the page. The familiar handwriting appeared beneath the flickering light of the land office lamp. A single sentence. Simple. Honest. Written months ago in Missouri. "I hope one day I find a place where kindness isn't something I have to earn." The room became impossibly quiet. Even the wind seemed farther away. Savannah remembered writing those words, a rainy afternoon, a sewing table beside a boarding house window, a scrap of paper tucked into the pocket of a shirt she had been repairing before mailing it west. She had forgotten it existed. Clay hadn't. "When I saw your name at the station," he said quietly, "I already knew who you were." Savannah looked up. His eyes held hers. Steady, patient, the same way they always had. You kept it? For months. Her throat tightened. Why? Clay glanced down at the paper, then back at her. Because it sounded lonely. The answer broke through every wall she had spent years building. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was poetic. Because it was true. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she realized they had started. Clay didn't move closer. Didn't reach for her. He simply stood there and let her feel what she needed to feel. For the first time, Savannah understood. The repaired shoes, the firewood, the peaches, the winter coat. None of it had been pity. Not once. Deputy Owen Brooks quietly escorted Ezekiel Price from the office. The door closed behind them. A few moments later, only Savannah and Clay remained. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Neither spoke. Some silences need room. Finally, Savannah lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. Clay nodded once. So am I. She looked up. You are? I should have told you sooner. Told me what? The corner of his mouth moved slightly. That you never had to earn your place at the ranch. The words settled somewhere deep inside her, a place that had spent years waiting to hear them. The ride back to Coyote Ridge happened beneath a sky full of falling snow. Neither spoke much. The horse's hooves crunched through the white road. The lantern hanging from the saddle swayed gently. Now and then Savannah glanced toward Clay. Each time she did, she found him looking ahead, giving her space, not because he was distant, because he understood. The ranch appeared through the snowfall shortly before midnight. Warm light glowed from the windows. Home. For the first time, Savannah allowed herself to think the word. Winter passed slowly. Then spring arrived. Snow retreated from the hills. Creeks swelled with fresh water. Green returned to the pastures. Life returned with it. Savannah stopped avoiding town, stopped lowering her eyes, stopped apologizing for taking up space. One bright morning, she walked into Cedar Ridge carrying the contract Price had tried to use against her. People watched. Whispers followed. But this time they didn't matter. She stopped in front of the courthouse, unfolded the contract, and tore it cleanly in half, then again and again. The pieces scattered across the wind. No speeches, no anger. Just a choice. Her choice. Several weeks later, Preston Hale appeared at the ranch. He looked older somehow. Smaller. The confidence he carried at the depot was gone. He offered money, an apology, a second chance to explain himself. Savannah listened politely, then shook her head. Not because she hated him, because she no longer needed anything from him. When he left, she felt lighter, as if a door she forgot was open had finally been closed. Spring deepened. Wildflowers appeared beyond the fences. The ranch grew busy again. Then one morning, Savannah opened her bedroom door and found a small wooden box sitting on the porch. She carried it inside, set it on the table, lifted the lid. Inside rested a pair of handmade leather shoes. Beautiful, strong, carefully stitched, made to last. Beneath them lay a folded note. For every road you choose for yourself. Savannah read it twice, then smiled. A real smile. The kind that begins quietly before reaching the eyes. She knew exactly who had written it. The sun was high when she found Clay repairing a section of fence near the south pasture. The hammer rested beside him. Fence posts lay stacked nearby. He looked up as she approached. Neither spoke at first. The spring breeze moved gently through the grass. Savannah stopped beside him, then reached out and placed her hand on his arm. The first time she had ever done so, Clay looked down briefly, then back at her. If you're still offering a home, she said softly. Her voice trembled only once. I'd like to stay. For a second, nothing moved. Not the grass, not the windmill, not even the birds overhead. Then Clay smiled, slowly, warmly, the way a sunrise arrives across open country. I never stopped. 1 year later, Cedar Ridge celebrated its summer festival beneath clear Montana skies. Children ran between vendor stalls. Fiddles played near the town square. Fresh lemonade sat in glass jars packed with ice. Savannah stood beside Clay near the edge of the crowd. The new shoes rested comfortably on her feet. The same feet that had once stepped off a stagecoach wearing torn leather and carrying more fear than hope. Clay's hand found hers. Natural now. Easy. As if it belonged there. A small boy wandered over carrying a paper windmill. He looked up at Savannah. "Miss Reed?" She smiled. "Yes? Is this where you came to find a husband?" Nearby, Clay laughed softly. Savannah looked toward him, then toward the ranch road stretching beyond town. The road that had brought her here. The road that had changed everything. Finally, she looked back at the boy. "No." The boy blinked. Savannah smiled again. Gentler this time. "This is where I came to find a home." The summer wind moved through Cedar Ridge, across the festival, across the fields, across Coyote Ridge Ranch waiting beyond the hills. And standing there, beside the man who had never asked her to earn kindness, Savannah finally understood something she had spent most of her life searching for. Home was never a place that demanded proof. Home was the place that opened its door before you knew you deserved one. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it looked exactly like a cowboy standing beside a fence beneath a Montana sky. Maybe that's why Savannah's story stays with us long after the last sunset fades. Not because of the torn shoes, not because of the long road that brought her to Cedar Ridge, but because at some point in our lives, many of us have stood where she once stood, wondering if we were too broken, too late, or too forgotten to truly belong anywhere. Imagine carrying every disappointment you've ever known, only to discover that the thing you needed most wasn't rescue. It was a place where you didn't have to earn kindness, a place where someone saw your worth before you could see it yourself. There is something beautiful about that kind of love, the kind that waits without demanding, the kind that protects without controlling, the kind that quietly stays when fear tells you to run. Perhaps the lesson isn't that life always gives us what we hope for. Perhaps it's that healing begins the moment we stop believing we must prove we deserve care, forgiveness, or a second chance. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know what touched your heart the most. Share your thoughts below. And if you enjoy stories about love, resilience, redemption, and the unexpected places people find home, I hope you'll stay a little longer. There are many more journeys waiting just beyond the next trail, and I'd be honored to share them with you.